All right, folks, so we're gonna break down this elk hindquarter into its various components. When we get done, we're gonna end up with a sirloin tip, the sirloin, top and bottom round, eye of round, and the shank. We're gonna cut some burger meat and some stew meat out of this also. The first thing we need to do is just trim off all of this fat. This was a very healthy animal, so there's a ton of fat on this thing. Now, if you were working with beef, a lot of this fat you're probably gonna want to retain, but with wild game like elk and deer, the fat doesn't freeze real well, and the biggest thing is it tends to leave kind of a waxy coating in your mouth, and so it's really something you're probably gonna want to get rid of. And so first thing we need to do is just start trimming this stuff off. All right, so I've got the majority of the fat trimmed off this thing. Now, what I do is just separate the major muscle groups. And so there's gonna be seams between these muscles where there's membrane that connects them. And all you've gotta do is just take your knife blade and find those seams. And a lot of times you can just do it with your thumb. But that connective tissue that's between the muscle groups, just cut that and these muscle groups will just lay apart. Once we get this dissected a little bit, I'll point out the different cuts and talk a little bit about some different recipes you can use them for. Now you can already see this big tight muscle up front. That's your sirloin. This piece right here, this is your bottom round, which is a little bit backwards from the way I have it right now, because normally you'd have it with the bone side up. This is your bottom round, your top round, and then on the inside there, you're gonna have a long, thin muscle called the eye of round. Sirloin tips up here. Now back here, I'm gonna go ahead and just make a cut straight across here. And I'm gonna take this shank and completely remove it. So I'm gonna cut through the knee right here. But to start that, I'm gonna come straight across. Find that joint. I'm gonna go ahead and just flip this over to get to the bottom side. All right, there we go. So that's our first cut. This is your shank. Now, there's a ton of good meat on this thing, but believe it or not, the shank is one of my favorite cuts. If you cook this right, it is very tender and it's very savory. The way that I like to cook this is to get a big cast iron pot, and I use a Dutch oven most of the time, and you put a little bit of oil in there, throw some flour on this thing, sear all the sides and brown it, and then just throw it in that Dutch oven with a little bit of red wine, maybe some vegetables, and cook it in the oven on something like 280 to 300 for 4 to 5 hours. And what that's gonna do is all of this tough connective tissue that's in here, all these tendons and ligaments and all that stuff, they are just absolutely gonna melt, and it makes like a gravy that goes over this thing. You serve that with steamed vegetables or mashed potatoes or something like that, and that is some very, very good stuff. So I'm gonna set that right here. I'm just gonna wrap that just like it is. I'm gonna put that straight into the freezer, bone and everything. All right, so now that we've got the shank off, I can see the ball head for the femur right here. and I can see the knee right here. And so this bone runs straight up like this. And you can see this seam that runs right here. So what I'm gonna do is just take my knife, cut along this seam, and we're gonna take this top round right off. And again, you can take your finger and stick it down in there so you can find that seam so that you're not actually cutting the muscle. You're just cutting between the muscles. So once you get down in there a little bit, you should be able to feel that bone. And you're gonna have to cut straight down until you find that bone. And then you can start just trimming, running your knife blade right along the edge of it. And start trimming that meat away. Now up here towards the knee, you're gonna have to cut down through this so that this meat will lay back. I'm gonna go ahead and just free up the top end of this big bone right here so that we can start pulling that out. All right, so there you go. You can break this thing in half, get to that marrow, roast these things up, make some awesome bone broth. All right, so now what I'm gonna do is just go ahead and take this top round right off of the bottom. That's gonna expose your eye of round inside there. And again, you're just cutting this membrane between the muscle groups to lay that thing back. Turn this way. Go ahead and separate the sirloin section. Okay, so now you can start to see the muscle groups starting to lay apart. This little strip right here, that's the eye around. All right, so we've got this hind quarter pretty much broken down into its primary pieces. We've got the shank, we've got the top round, the eye of round, bottom round, and then this whole big hunk here is the sirloin. You got your sirloin tip and then the main body of the sirloin. Now I want to talk a little bit about how to use this stuff. So your bottom round is actually comes from the outside of the animal, and it's a really long-grained, long-fibered, really tough muscle. You could cut steaks out of this, and sometimes I cut carne asada out of it, and I'll show you how to do that here in a little bit. But for the most part, you're gonna wanna use this for either stew meat or grind or very thinly cut, maybe cube steaks or something like that, because it is such a tough muscle. If you wanna cut steaks out of your hindquarters, the top round is where you're gonna wanna cut them from. And so what we're gonna do is just take a bunch of this stuff and just kind of set it to the side. And we're gonna start with your top round, and I'll show you how to cut those steaks out. So this is the inside here. Got the outside. There's still a little bit of fat on here. We're gonna spend a little bit of time just trimming this thing up and making it look pretty before we go cutting on it. Now, personally, I like to spend a little bit of time getting as much of this silver skin, sinew, whatever you want to call it, getting all this stuff off of here. Back when I first started doing my own butchering, I didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to that, especially if I was going to grind it. But the thing that I found out real quickly is that running a bunch of sinew through your grinders is pretty hard on it. So your top round is going to have this outside piece here. I'm going to go ahead and just trim that off, and we'll clean that up a little bit and just use that for a grind. Throw that right over there. And then we've got one more little seam here that I'm going to break down. Basically, all I'm doing is finding all these little seams in between these muscles and cutting those connections between the muscle groups. All right, so that little piece right there, I don't know what the technical name of that is. You could use that as a roast, cut it into grind, make stew meat, fajita meat, shish kebabs, whatever you want. All right, so now we've got our big hunk of top round. There's gonna be a big piece of sinew right here. You need to get that off, so just slide your knife right up underneath that. Take that off. All right, so now we've got a pretty lean, nice top round. We could use this as a roast. What I'm gonna do is just go ahead and cut this end off where it tapers down. Set that right there. And now I'm just gonna start staking this thing up. I like my steaks fairly thick. There you go. That is a beautiful top round steak. Now these pieces, you could use them for anything. You could grind them up. You could use them for stew meat, fajita, cut them up thin, make jerky out of them. I'm just going to go ahead and cut them in about 2-inch cubes so we can throw them in the grinder. All right, so I've got 5 big steaks out of our top round. Got a little bit of chunked meat for either shish kebabs, grind, stew meat, whatever you want. Now we're gonna move on to the bottom round. So the bottom round is this big long muscle here from the outside of the leg of the elk. And the first thing you're gonna notice is that this thing is absolutely covered with silver skin or sinew. All that stuff you're gonna wanna take off, because when you cook it, that stuff's just gonna go shrink up and get super tough. So it comes down to a point right here. I'm just gonna slide my knife under that. Take the end off. Then I'm gonna start working that stuff down. Now, if you get the technique right, you can put just a little bit of upward angle on your knife and slide right along that sinew and really not lose any meat at all. Now on the other side, you've got another big piece of sinew. And this sinew actually runs down between two sections of this muscle right here. And so what I'm going to do is put this thing up on end like this. And if you've got a good sharp knife, a lot of times you can just run your knife right along that sinew and take that top piece of meat right off of it and expose that sinew so you can take it off easier. All right. So I'm not worried about how pretty this is because this is all just going to get chunked up anyway. All right, so now that we've got this piece of sinew here exposed, got a little bit more there, meat. We can go ahead and slide our knife right underneath that. If you take your time, you can trim all this fat and silver skin off and really not lose a bunch of meat. End up with a nice pretty cut. All right, so we pretty much, I got one more piece here. Pretty much got this bottom round cleaned up. Now, if this was a beef, this section up here would be your rump roast. I'm not even gonna worry about that too much. I'm just gonna cut that off. And again, cut that up for grind. I'll cut this other tapered end off. All right, so we've got this nice section of trimmed up bottom round, and you could leave it like this and just use it as a roast, maybe braise it. What I like to do with it is cut really thin, like 1/4 inch thick slices, and use this as carne asada. What you can do is take a thin cutting board, so this one's less than 1/4 inch, put it right there, move this over to the edge, and I'm going to just use this cutting board as a thickness guide. And to do this, you're going to need a long, very sharp knife. So again, just use this as a thickness guide. I'm going to push it over just a little bit. Actually, I'm going to move this around, put that cut edge towards the board. All right, so these little steaks, these are 1/4 inch thick or so. You can marinate these things, get your grill super hot, just throw them on there, roast some poblanos or some jalapenos or something like that, and it makes amazing carne asada. You can slice them up, make fajitas with them, whatever. I love these little steaks like this. All right, so we're gonna take this, put that right over there. This piece that's left, we'll just throw that in the grind pile. We use a lot of burger in our house, and so we tend to grind a lot of stuff. You don't have to grind all this. You could certainly make stew meat. You could cut it up for fajitas. You could do jerky out of it. All right, so the eye of round right here, it looks a lot like a tenderloin or a piece of a backstrap or something. It's not going to be nearly as tender as one of those things. It's actually a fairly tough muscle. Just going to clean this up, get a little bit of this silver skin off of it, and then I'm just going to wrap this just like it is. This one, you know, you can take just like you would a neck roast or something like that, just braise this, slice it really thin, and we'll make a nice meal. All right, so now we've got this big old hunk of meat right here, which is going to be your sirloin. So I'm going to break this down. I've got the sirloin tip up here, and then the main body down here. This is also called, sometimes you'll hear it called a football roast, and you'll see why here in just a second. All right, so you can see that thing. That's just a big, dense hunk of meat, kind of shaped like a football. I'm gonna set that there for now. This piece that comes off the top, your sirloin tip, I'm just going to trim that up as best I can, and we'll just wrap that up as a roast. This sirloin tip, I'm just going to leave it like this. I'm going to wrap it just like this. You can use this as a roast, or if you want to, when you pull it out, thaw it out, cut it into shish kebabs, cut it into steaks, pretty much whatever you want. But if you leave it whole like this, it's going to give you more options when you pull it out of the freezer. All right, so now we're down to the sirloin main. Again, any kind of silver skin or membrane that you see covering the outside, just go ahead and trim that off. Now this thing is really, you're not going to be able to get all the silver skin off of this because it's got a bunch of it. There's a bunch of little muscles that actually make up this bigger muscle. And so if you wanted to grind this up, you could spend a lot of time sitting there trimming this thing. But I'm going to get the major stuff, and then I'm just going to cut this into two roasts. I'm just going to cut it in half, just like this. And just use this as a braising roast. This is going to be something that you're going to cook like you would cook the shank. So just get a hot skillet, put a little bit of flour in there if you want to, brown this thing, and then put it in a Dutch oven and cook it low and slow for quite a while. And it'll break down all those connective tissues. And so you can see the different muscles that make this thing up. You can see the silver skin here, here, and here, and here. So that's going to be ready. I'm going to wrap that just like that. Wrap that just like that. And we're pretty much done with the hindquarter. So out of this hindquarter, we got one very large shank, got two sirloin roasts, we've got a pile of grind, we've got some trimmings here that we're going to trim up a little bit more also to go into the grind pile. This stuff, there's a lot of this stuff that's very, very lean. You could use this for stew. I mean, you could use it for any number of things. Personally, we use a lot of burger in our house, so we grind pretty much all the trimmings. We've got a sirloin tip right here that we can use either for shish kebabs, roast, steaks, anything we want to do with that. We got a pile of very thin, thinly cut carne asada steaks from the bottom round. We got the eye of round here. And then we got 5 really thick, nice steaks from the top round. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and move on to the shoulder. Now we're gonna approach this in a very similar way that we did the hindquarter, trimming up all the fat and membrane that we can find, and then basically just separating the muscle groups. Now, we're gonna have a shank and a couple of flat iron steaks that I'll show you, but for the most part, when it comes to shoulders, I tend to grind a lot, again, because we use a lot of burger. Now, if you have a saw, you can cut some blade roasts out of this thing, but again, for the shoulders, I'm primarily gonna be grinding this thing. So I'm gonna go ahead and take my blade and run it right up underneath the back side of the shoulder blade. Now on the shoulder blade on the top side, if you flip this thing over, there's gonna be a ridge running right down the center. And so you're not gonna be able to slice the meat off of it without flipping this thing over and finding that ridge, which I'll show you right now. So right here, you can see that seam right there. There's a bone that sticks up right there. You can take your knife and run right down on either side of that bone. To help free up that meat. All right, so right here is the base of the shoulder blade. There's going to be a joint that connects the shoulder blade to the rest of the bones. If you stick your knife in there, you can peel that away. All right, so now when we run our knife in between the blade, shoulder blade, and the meat, that should just come right off. Now this right here, this is your flat iron. Now the thing about the flat iron is there's a piece of sinew that runs right down through the thickness of this thing. And so you're gonna have to take your fillet knife and try to follow that sinew as best you can. And if you can do that, you can slick that sinew off and you'll have two nice flat iron steaks. If you don't want to worry about it, just cut it up and grind it. Lay it down, take your sharp fillet knife, make you a little cut to start with back here. Put your knife in there, grab hold to that piece that you started and hold that. And then just work your knife down. Again, just like you're filleting a fish. You can take that sinew right off of it. And you've got a nice pretty piece of meat. Now, like I said, there's a piece of sinew that runs down the middle of this, which you're not going to want to leave in there. So to get that out, you can start down here where you can see it. Make a little cut to expose it. Exposing that silver skin without cutting it takes a little bit of practice, but you can, if you work at it a little bit, you can get it. Now what I'm doing to run this knife blade along this sinew, I'm just keeping the cutting edge down, and I'm not slicing it. I'm more shaving across the top. So you'd be using your knife almost like a scraper. If you do like that, a lot of times you can follow that. Move that a little bit so you can see it. All right. All right, so that's one piece of flat iron right there. Now we've got this other one, and all that sinew is exposed. So now we'll just take our fillet knife, trim off that little piece. And with that sinew flat down against your cutting board, should be able to take your fillet knife, put it in there, and slick that stuff right off. And now you've got two really nice flat iron steaks. I'm going to go ahead and take the shank off of here so that we don't have to deal with it. Now this shank is a little bit odd shaped compared to the rear shank because you're going to have this big elbow knuckle thing on the back. I'm going to take a saw once we get this broken down. I'm going to take a saw and cut that knuckle off of there so it doesn't create problems when we go to wrap it. You don't have to take it off, but certainly going to be a lot easier to wrap and fit into a pod if you do. All right, so there's your front shank, and here's that big knuckle that I was talking about. And it's a fairly thin piece of bone back here, so you don't have to cut very deep to be able to break it off. You cut it about halfway and then you can just snap it off. So from here on out, personally, I don't get very technical about it because I do just mainly grind everything. There are some roasts on here. You could cut some shoulder roasts out of here. Honestly, I don't know what the cuts are on the front shoulder because I've always just ground them up mostly. So there's no real need to kind of walk you through deboning this thing. I'm just going to run my knife down here, find that bone, take that out, and separate the muscles, take the silver skin off, put that all in the grind pile, and then we'll pick this back up when we're actually grinding meat, and then we'll wrap it all up to wrap up the video. All right, so when it comes to wrapping this stuff, I don't use any saran wrap or vacuum packing or anything like that. I just go with straight wax butcher paper, and I've been doing it like this for close to 20 years. I've never had any trouble with meat going bad or freezer burn or anything like that, but I do pay attention to get 2 layers of paper. And usually, unless you're wrapping a big piece, you can do that with 1 piece of butcher paper. You don't have to actually wrap it twice. So with this burger, just bring that back, roll it over once until you can see your paper under there. Wrap your ends. And that thing is wrapped with 2 layers of paper, and that'll keep in the freezer for a long time. We don't keep meat, we usually eat it before it's a year old, and so we're not keeping meat for multiple years. I guess if you were keeping it for a long time, you might want to look into saran wrap or something like that, but I've never felt the need to do that, never seen any trouble with it at all.